Well, let's get more on the parliamentary inquiry into the Racial Discrimination Act. The report, which considered whether parts of the legislation are too restrictive on free speech, was handed down today. But it didn't specifically recommend major changes to Section 18C, which makes it illegal to offend, insult or to humiliate someone based on their race. Simon Breheny is the director of the Australian Institute of Public Affairs, who's been calling for the complete repeal of Section 18C. He joins us now from Melbourne. Simon, thanks very much for being with us. Now, as I mentioned, you are in favour of repealing the 18C Act because you claim that it sets arbitrary limits on freedom of speech, it undermines democracy and it threatens social cohesion. Explain to us how so.
Well, I don't claim that it does those things. It, in fact, does those things. We've seen a number of cases over the past few years. The past few months in particular, I think, have really shone a light on how dangerous Section 18C has become. And I think potentially the best example of this has been the case against several students at the Queensland University of Technology. I think this has really shown Australians how far Section 18C goes in restricting freedom of speech. I think a lot of people were caught by surprise by this case. I think a lot of people were disgusted really by the fact that you could have a number of young students, 20 years old in some cases, being dragged through what has now been almost a 4-year legal saga. And I think that's been really important in building the case now to the point where I think the latest polling we had showed that 48% of Australians were in favour of removing at least the first 2 words of the provision that we're talking about, Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act.
You are, however, talking about one high-profile case of a handful of cases, really. But how confident are you that repealing the 18C won't lead to the arbitrary discrimination of minorities or various ethnic or religious groups?
Well, I think what's really important is that we make sure that people are aware that there are a number of laws at the state level and at the Commonwealth level that protect people from harassment, from intimidation, from threats. There's any number of laws of that kind, and I think it's really important that people understand that those laws exist because in many cases those are criminal laws, and it's not just a matter for 2 private parties taking a case or a complaint through the Human Rights Commission or to the courts. It actually means that there's a higher threshold there. It means that the police are involved, it means that there's an investigation that takes place. And in cases where you're talking about threats or harassment, I think that's appropriate. I think that the police should be involved. I think there should be an investigation. But that, I think, is the threshold really where the law should intervene. At a point where it doesn't reach that threshold, I think we go far too far down this path of restricting freedom of speech.
Explain to us then, why is it those words offend and insult, I guess in a way offend or insult you when it comes to freedom of speech?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people recognise that to make it unlawful to offend someone or to make it unlawful to insult someone does go too far. And I think that if you ask most Australians what their views are about that, they'll tell you that that doesn't really seem to make much sense. That doesn't really gel with their understanding of what it means to live in a liberal democracy like Australia. And even if it's on the basis of race, and I think that most people find it quite abhorrent that you would want to offend someone or insult someone on the basis of race, I think most people recognise it's probably not for the government to intervene, it's probably for individuals like you and I to make sure that we're across the issues, to make sure that we push back on racist and bigoted ideas. That's all part of what it is to live in a healthy civil society.
Sure.
I think that's really
we
important.
have, however, Simon, seen the rise of the far right in some parts of the world. There are all the indications, of course, that a similar wave is happening in Australia as well. If there is a time that the 18C is relevant, it's now, to provide protection for those who may be discriminated against.
I can see where that argument might come from, but frankly I couldn't disagree more. And the reason I can't disagree more is because one of the reasons that we see a rise in the far right around the world, the rise of people who have quite hateful and bigoted views, is because they feel as though they're under the thumb of government. They feel as though that there's this idea that there's a political elite and a media elite that are keeping them under the thumb, that are stopping them from saying the things that they want to say. And Section 18C is a part of that. I think Section 18C is a part of the problem, not a part of the solution. And if we want to try and avoid that sort of thing happening in Australia, I think we have to embrace freedom of speech.
Simon, there is a concern, however, that if repealing 18C might mean that it is sending a message to those who may have extremist views on race or religion to actually voice or act on these views.
Well, I think in making changes to the law, I think in reforming Section 18C, the Parliament should keep in mind why they're doing that. And I think that the chief reason for making changes to Section 18C has nothing to do with this idea of giving a green light to racists. It's all to do with that liberal democratic ideal of expanding freedom of speech. And if that's the idea behind changes to the law, then Parliament should make that clear. When making changes of this kind, I think members of Parliament should stand up and say, this is important for reasons of freedom of speech. And if you're a bigot or if you're hateful and you have things like that that you want to contribute to the public debate, then I'm going to use my freedom of speech to push back against that. I think that's the message that members of Parliament should be seeking to send in reforming Section 18C.
Simon Breheny, thank you for sharing your views with us.
My pleasure.